Good evening. Can you all hear me in the back? Could I just see a hand in the back? Thank you very much. That's good to see. My name is Uta Poiga, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. And it's my privilege to welcome you this evening to our event in what we sometimes call short the Civility Series on transitions in the US democracy, the presidential inauguration, policies, and protests. We know that we live in unusual times when 2 days after the inauguration of an American president, we can find the following headline in the Sunday Times. On the front page, relatively small, world leaders face new era in Washington. Somewhat larger, slamming media, Trump advances two falsehoods. And third, the lead article, defiant yet jubilant voices flood US cities at women's rallies defending rights feared at risk. And a bit further into the paper, one could see what does executive order against the health law actually do? And on the Sunday op-ed page, we had an article titled Racial Progress, then Racist Progress. So much to talk about. Let me say a few words about the mission of our campus series titled Conflict, Civility, Respect, Peace, Northeastern Reflects. President Aoun, about 4 years ago, outlined an ambitious agenda for our university. One of the things that he stressed was that it is through plurality that we do live up to our highest calling, to be a community dedicated to human advancement. And it is in this spirit that the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, the Office of Student Affairs, in cooperation with the Northeastern School of Law and with an organizational committee with faculty and members of student affairs from around the campus, has organized this series of campus conversations over the last 4 years. Recognition of diversity and plurality is central to building a strong campus as well as a functioning society. And yet campuses, like other communities, can also be subject to efforts, sometimes from the outside, to sow conflict based on religion, race, ethnicity, citizenship, gender, sexual orientation, political opinion, or other individual traits. So many of us worry that the transition to a new presidency has further exacerbated a sense of deep divisions in this country and in the broader world. We cannot let this sense of division and the fact that what is hopeful for some generates fear for others prevent us from having difficult conversations. We need spaces on campus and beyond where folks with different political opinions can be in conversation. It seems ever more important today to talk about citizenship, to talk about civic norms, to talk about the ways in which we construct inclusive communities, the way we construct responsible arguments and evidence, the way we use evidence, the ways we secure private and public institutions to ensure open exchange, well-being, and resilience for everybody living on our campus, in this country, in the broader world. Northeastern faculty, students, and staff are deeply engaged in studying the promises of diversity as well as the roots of hatred and violence from a wide variety of perspectives and in numerous locations of the globe. Students and faculty and staff also participate actively in local, national, and international efforts directed at preventing violence, resolving conflict, building resilience, building civility, building peace. As members of the Northeastern community, we recognize that our work in the wider world can only be effective if we carefully reflect on our challenges at home. In fact, valuing diversity and building bridges across our differences are essential for establishing sustainable communities over the long term and for educating global citizens and leaders. Our series is designated to elevate civility and ethical reasoning on campus and globally. And it is wonderful to see many of you, staff members, faculty, students here, because these conversations can only succeed with strong participation from the community. Our ambition is for Northeastern to be recognized for what the organizing committee of the series has called civic sustainability. And our working definition of civic sustainability is something that I would definitely like you to keep in mind. It has several key features. To practice civility while engaging with diverse opinions. And we do this, of course, today in such a broad framework. We'll later on alert you again to the events that you see that will be smaller workshops, conversations that you can engage in after today's event in the following days. You have them on your postcards. Again, to practice civility while engaging with diverse opinion is one of the cornerstones of civic sustainability. Another one is to acknowledge past problems, to broaden personal networks, and also to find common ground in social action. In this spirit, I want to invite Dean Bob Jose to the podium, who will say a few words about tonight and our series from the perspective of Dean of Student Affairs. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And again, on behalf of Student Affairs, I'm very happy to welcome you. On January 20th, many people around our campus felt that we moved into a new world, a world they never thought they would move into. And as Dean Poiger had spoken about what has happened in our country in the period of time since the election, we have seen that come into sharp relief here on campus. We have seen those with great hope, those who feel, amongst those who feel that the American dream had left them behind and that the promise of America had not been realized to them. We also have seen on campus great fear amongst those of marginalized identities who feel that civil liberties and personal freedoms are being rolled back. We have seen the honest and open discussion around this topic that we're here to be about tonight. We have seen individuals who are legitimately and honestly trying to wrap their brains around all that this means and that what it means for them and for their families and for those that they care for, about their communities. We've also seen in the advent of the inauguration and the election, aspects of our community emboldened to speak and act in ways that are absolutely incongruent with the values that Northeastern holds. We have a whole set of individuals, students, who are wrestling with immigration concerns, wrestling with that, who live with daunting uncertainty and anxiety. And it's because of that, we must continue to reach out to them and let them know, and to let the entire community know that this university, our university, will safeguard those members of the community. The We Care office, located in 104L Hall, has been designated as the hub of services for these students. The hub would provide information and resources and services and support, especially around issues concerning DACA. We live in an interesting time, and as Dean Poiger has said, here and now, this is the time that we're having this conversation, but it's my hope that it would not end today. And we have set forth a couple of platforms that hopefully some of you would participate in. Tomorrow and Thursday in Wren Park, 909, there'll be a dialogue to talk more about what we're talking about tonight. The same thing will happen in the sacred space upstairs in the second floor of L from 11:45 to 12:45, and in Wren Park both days from 12 to 1:30. I am always encouraged when I see members of the community come together to hear about a topic that affects us all. I hope that our discussion tonight will be fruitful and will engage us to continue the conversations as we move forward, going forward. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
And yes, Yes, as Dean Jose has alluded to, this does provide us an important opening for intellectual exchange, as well as the need to be very, very careful in how we interact, but not careful in the sense of not seeking out controversy and not also being able to talk across our differences. It's then my great pleasure to turn to our moderator for this evening's panel, Rebecca Riccio, who's the director of the Social Impact Lab in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, and she will guide first our panelists and then you, the audience, through this evening. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Dean Poiger. It is such an honor to be on the stage with these colleagues this evening. And for those of you who are wondering, there is no pressure whatsoever moderating a panel on democracy in the United States today. Actually, I don't feel a sense of pressure so much as a sense of urgency. Every 4 years, we celebrate the inauguration of a new president as a symbol of the stability and durability of our democracy. But we've always known that democracy is neither immutable nor perfect. It is instead contingent on a whole host of factors that can both support its success and threaten it. That is not new. That has been the case since the beginning of our democracy. But the escalation of the rancor and divisiveness and controversies across the political spectrum throughout this election period and since the inauguration and transition, I think force us to ask ourselves whether we have frameworks for understanding the complex and dynamic relationships between those forces in a 21st century globalized world. Are we prepared to even understand what's happening in a way that allows us to fulfill our responsibilities as informed and engaged citizens? Tonight, as our panelists provide context for helping us understand the transition, the first 100 days of the Trump administration, and what we might expect moving forward, they will touch upon several of the forces I'm referring to: the fragility of political institutions, the changing media industry, changing norms of civil discourse, global power shifts, growing inequality, and so on. As you listen to them, I encourage you not to think of those as isolated phenomena, but to try to visualize how they are related to each other. Try to visualize the interplay of these forces and to embrace the complexity of the world that you live in, as overwhelming as that may seem. And I encourage you to embrace that complexity, not because any of us can master it, and certainly not because we can control it. But the more comfortable you become with that notion, the more effective you will be in finding the levers that you can push to engage in and affect democracy, no matter where you are in the political spectrum. You can choose the levers that are meaningful to you, but are also more effective in relation to others. I can guarantee that as you start to think about the world in those terms, you will recognize that there is not a major or discipline or career aspiration represented in this room that doesn't have important levers to push. I would like to just reiterate what Bob and Uta said about the importance of us coming together to listen and learn from each other, to engage in and model civil discourse in a community that has a very diverse array of political perspectives. Tonight, I hope that all of us, despite what we're feeling about the election, pro or con, can celebrate what it means to come here in a civil discourse with a shared commitment to fact and reason and mutual respect. With that, I would like to introduce our panelists. I'm only going to name them by titles because the biographies are in the program, and I think we'd rather spend our time talking with each other than hearing about how amazing we all are. So, starting on my right, we have Stephen Flynn, Professor of Political Science in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, Margaret Burnham, Professor of Law, Carol Bell, Assistant Professor of Communication in the Communication Studies in the College of Arts, Media, and Design, and Jonathan Kaufman, Professor of Journalism, also in the College of Arts, Media, and Design. Each of the panelists will give some brief comments. We will then have a roundtable discussion, and then we will open the floor to questions from all of you. Steve.
Great. Well, good evening all. I'm really thrilled to be here. I want to offer a bit of a perspective of, for those of you who may be in the anxiety part of the spectrum here, maybe a little bit of antidepressant kind of perspective here relative to the mechanics and part of transitions and some of the constraints that any president has over the next 100 days. And then I'd like to talk about maybe the flip side of this coin, which is what I see as enormous capacity within civil society to essentially engage in ways that it has not engaged to date on some very important issues, and how they might be able to really get us to a better place. So just by a little bit of background in terms of how it applies to the conversation tonight, I had an opportunity a number of years ago now, and actually at the end of the Reagan administration, I was wrapping up a program at the Fletcher School, and my dissertation was on presidential crisis decision making. And so I had the gall to think, well, the best place to figure that out would be to go where the president is. So I was going to try to get into the White House. And I went through a series of interviews in the last days of the Reagan administration. And it turned out that everybody that the new administration, then George Herbert Walker Bush, he really wanted to put his imprimatur on that he was not a carryover of the Reagan administration. And so there was a massive house cleaning. Everybody who was going to presumably bring me on got fired. And the one person who didn't turn out to be a military officer who was in the White House, running the White House military office, and he brought me on board. And so I was there at a relatively early time for a transition from the Reagan administration into the Bush administration. And this was, the Cold War was still going, so the stakes were pretty high on that transition. So I had that perspective, and then fast forward a few more years, I had the opportunity to serve on President Obama's transition team back in late 2008, 2009 as his Homeland Security Policy Advisor, and got to see both the handing of the baton from George W. Bush into the new administration. And so those are pieces that I might take this first part of trying to essentially talk about the messiness of transitions and the inherent constraints that places actually on presidents to get things done that they might really want to do. I often say to my students in a classic 101 political science, power in Washington is largely the power of negation, to make things not happen. Really hard to make things happen. And for one part, because the founders came up with this brilliant sort of design. It was anti-Newtonian. It was basically share the powers across multiple branches. So anything the government really does is things that there is a lot of support to do. Otherwise, there's lots of sources of friction to keep it from getting done. That is almost especially true, interestingly, at a transition time, not because the president often usually has this honeymoon period, and so therefore he has a little bit of juice to kind of push forward what to do, but the machinery isn't actually in place to execute on a lot of that, particularly in the early days. This transition is particularly messy in terms of capacity to actually execute on anything that the president might want to do. I would have to say at the outset that there isn't a lot of clarity about what the president really wants to do, except at a really headline level. All that being translated into real policies that take real actions, that's pretty fuzzy stuff, and often in many issues he's said both sides of the coin. So it's going to be very difficult for the bureaucracy to even interpret what his intent is. Right now, the way peculiarly is organized his White House is he essentially brought 4 people to be his deputies. I came out of a military background, retired Coast Guard officer. Generally, you need one person in charge. All right, and there's somebody usually called the chief of staff, and that kind of drives the thing. But he's decided to have 4 people, including his son-in-law being one of them. This is going to be very interesting, okay? Because really, it means all these 4 people are going to be trying to figure out where they start and stop, being able to push down beneath them what is really going to the president really wants. And the president seems fairly fickle about what he wants, so that's going to create a lot of creative moments, let's just say, I think, in that dynamic. The other, in terms of just sheer bodies, some of you may have seen the numbers here, but the president needs to appoint 400 positions that are congressionally blessed, right? So they got to go through the gauntlet of our congressional hearing, committee process, and recommendations to the floor and the Senate. There are 400 of those positions to be filled, and so far he's named only the cabinet secretaries. All right, and 2 of them are in place right now, with a third today with the new director of CIA. We got a long ways to go before he even has people in place to actually execute on what the president's policy might be. Meanwhile, back in the White House, the National Security Council staff, which is kind of the epicenter where you coordinate interagency, that's very much a work in progress as well. You have very few people there. They're working for the National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, not a relation of mine. He maybe a distant one. We Irish are all tied together one way or another. But in any event, but he is involved with that trying to build up the team, and it's very early on. And that's a pretty critical role because that's what weaves together most of the things the government needs to do involves multiple departments working together. So this is going to be really hard to get this whole thing moving forward. So let me now flip to where I think there may be some opportunity for the kind of things we saw on Saturday. It turns out that civil society really is important and that it really needs to have a voice in what our government decides it wants to do and how it does it. And there's a number of PowerPoints for it to achieve that. It can achieve it at the local level and the state level, and I think we're going to see more of that needing to happen, and in fact is happening. That's the nice thing about the federalism form of government. And if people are basically sense that the federal government may not be working the way it wants it to do, one of the ways they can deal with that is to take more action at the local level, at the state level, to work on issues that are really meaningful to them. And that's something that I think folks are waking up a bit more to do, and I hope very much will engage around. We do have a legislative branch, and they do have to respond to constituents. And the extent to which it becomes clear that those constituents, and it looks like a lot of them, are moving in one direction that may be not where the president may want to go, that's a pretty powerful lever. It needs to be activated and needs to be worked. Not with a one-time march, but by real proactive efforts. So what I'm trying to just lay out here in a very brief form, because we got a lot to cover here, is that this process of which our government is set up doesn't allow somebody just because they really think that when they won the election and they're the president, that they can do whatever they want. All right? We didn't build this. The founders were very careful in how they designed this thing here. There's things that are worrisome. But the fact is there are levers that we the people have to make sure that that's not actually moves in ways that are damaging to our democracy. But also there's all these constraints with just the very size and magnitude and complexity of running the government itself. That's a constraint. And so hopefully being mindful of that, there's breathing room, so we'll take a deep breath, and let's figure out how we work together to make sure that our society is going where we want to go by having our voices a part of the process. That would be, I guess, the message I'd like to start with. Let's off with. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to step up here.
Sure.
So, thank you very much, Dean Poiga, and the members of the committee for organizing this very timely and important discussion about the future of our country. And thank you, Steve, for laying out exactly what it is we face, and also for stressing the critical importance of civic engagement as we move forward. And that's the point that I want to focus on in my few moments up here. So here we are. We stand 3 days after the largest demonstration in the history of our country, and 4 days after the inauguration for the first time in the history of our country of a president who has had no previous political experience. So this is an unprecedented moment. The historical conjuncture that is of these two events that is full of both crisis and opportunity. It is also unsettling, it's challenging, it's frightening, it's demanding, and exciting all at the same time. It's exciting because it appears that we are, as Steve suggests, at a moment when really all things are possible. And both the unimaginable as well as the dreaded are all up for grabs. But it's also demanding because it does place on all of us a heavy sense that ours is that history is our personal responsibility in the near and the long term, that what we do in the upcoming years is critically important both for the future of our history, for the future of our country, but for as well for how we understand what our past means for us as a country. This is, as I said, let me say a few words first about the demonstration in Washington, which I know many of you probably attended. If you weren't there personally, I know all of us were there virtually. All of us have seen the photographs, the very exciting photographs and videos about that amassing of the women across our country and indeed across the world, along with their allies. So as I said, it was the largest gathering in history, but it was preceded by many other gatherings of feminists and their allies in our country, in Washington, D.C., and really all across the country. So what specifically was different about this particular demonstration? What was different about what it foreshadows for the future, and what was different about what was foretold by the demonstration? As I said, it was at once both glorious and dangerous and forceful and glamorous. It was peaceful and aggressive. It was a metaphor for strength. It was an expression of possibility. It was a claim about the necessity for a new multi-racial, multi-sexual movement, a powerful rejection of the most brazenly misogynistic campaign in the history of our country. So in that sense, history will turn on this moment in many ways. But as I say, we also need to look backwards. So this demonstration stood on the shoulders of the Seattle demonstrations against the WTO in 1999, when people once again got out and claimed the streets. It stands on the shoulders of the Occupy movement, of the movement for Black Lives. You will remember the 2006 movement for immigrant rights in our own city here, when hundreds of people came out day after day after day and claimed the streets in support of immigrant rights. And it was foreshadowed as well by the demonstrators who continue today to stand at Standing Rock in favor of clean water for all Americans. So it was a demonstration that proclaimed that people, first of all, have a right to gather, a duty, a responsibility to gather in new ways, to use new implements to ensure that they are effective in confronting authorities that do not reflect their values, their traditions, their hopes, and their aspirations for their country. These movements, these new movements of the 21st century, salute no titular head. There is no Martin Luther King out there in front of these movements. These movements are leaderless. They're horizontal in nature. In that sense, in many ways, they favor the traditions and the perspectives of women in leadership forms. They're movements that are linked by technology and social media. They use the digital space to claim a public space, to occupy a public space. And they're movements that are multi in so many ways, in the numbers and kinds of faces and personalities. But notwithstanding their multiplicity, women have predominated in all of the movements that I've described. Women have predominated in all of those movements. And so Hillary Clinton is not our president, but we stand on a new platform today. And so that's something we need to celebrate. Now, the millions of people who marched in our country on Saturday don't all share the same politics. And so that will be fractious as we move forward. What they do share is the need to separate themselves. What they did share on that day was the need to separate themselves from their ordinary lives, get on a bus or a train, and do something extraordinary, to come together, to congregate in public, in mass, to express their belonging, that they belong to some community that had some common values, and to give a concrete shape and form to what had before Saturday really been abstract, that the anxiety, all elections produce a certain amount of sort of unsettling anxiety, but this election really produced true trauma among many Americans. And the movement of women, the Women's March across the country on Saturday did a lot to if not settle and resolve and dissipate that trauma, it did a lot to harness it in really important ways. These women came together, women and men and children came together to capture the capital of our country, to say that it was indeed our capital, to confirm their potential. The movement and the march was at once symbolic and actual. It was a rehearsal, as Steve has pointed out, for the future, in that it directed our attention to the kinds of strategies that will be needed in the future, while it also reclaimed victories that were thought to have been, we thought were solidly in the bank, and then seemed to perhaps have been upended by this election. So the question as we move forward is, how do we sustain this movement? How do you maintain women's leadership in this movement? How do you maintain a movement that is value-driven rather than issue-specific, a movement that rejects top-down models of social change while still being smart, effective, strategic? How do we maintain a movement where the costs of participation are sufficiently low so that masses of people can continue to associate with it, and where the cost of participation are low and the barriers as well to participation are low, so that those numbers and those voices can still be heard. Now, a moment left, and let me just say two things. Number one, marches are one thing. They are the beginnings and the expressions of movements, but they also fail. And so, for example, I mentioned the immigrant rights movement of 2006. And as I said, that took the country by a storm with a new show of enthusiasm, a deep sense of urgency. It spread really all across the country, but like wildfire. But by 2007, it disappeared. It wasn't there anymore. And not only that, but it failed in its major objective, which was to enact comprehensive immigration reform. So we need to learn from that. I'll refer to one other movement, which is the Occupy movement. In some sense, the Occupy movement planted the seeds of Trump's success, to the extent that the Occupy movement rejected neoliberalism, acknowledged that the politics of global capital have wreaked havoc on American lives, and it was that message that Trump actually was able to grab onto and to exploit, and ultimately to prove to be a winning message. But as we look towards the future, a couple of things I think need to be borne in mind. First of all, we have to understand that radicalism, such as we saw in this election, reflected mostly in Bernie Sanders' campaign, is as American as every other political form. It's not foreign, it's ours. And those of us who claim it, those of us who fly that banner, can have new hope that the views of radicals, that is to say, broad sense of economic and social equity and equality, that voice is not going to die. Secondly, the parlous state of the Democratic Party. That's something that can't be ignored. The weakness of our unions, the rural-metro split, these have all been rehearsed. But also we have to realize that the truisms that we once accepted as Americans and that we thought would be in place for our children need to now be reconsidered and re-questioned. For example, we once thought that the kind of virulent anti-Semitism that surfaced all across Europe in the 20th century and that still thrives in Europe was foreign to our own shores. That has to be rethought in light of the nomination of Steve Bannon as a top advisor to our new president. Feminism Again, we thought these victories were won and secure. Not so much. As we talk about inclusion and diversity in our own community, we have to realize that you can talk about inclusion and diversity and still fail to recognize the plight of millions of people across our country whose lives are worse than they were yesterday, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's not enough to talk about inclusion and diversity in Wall Street or out in Silicon Valley or at the universities. That really doesn't get us there, as important as it is. We really do have to recognize the reality of those lives that spoke up and that claimed Trump, howsoever wrongly, as the voice of their future. I could say more, but I believe my time is run out.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of public communication and public discourse and public opinion in this transition. So in particular, looking to examples from the past for insight into the present. After all, American democracy is built not just on laws, obviously those are important, and on the structure of the government, but also on adherence to democratic norms or traditions and standards of behavior. So past administrations can be instructive. On the other hand, right now, we also have to bear in mind that this is not business as usual. This president and this new administration prides themselves on being bold and on breaking with tradition. As if to underscore this point, the president danced to Frank Sinatra's My Way, so that even the theme song that he danced to at his inaugural ball made a statement. And he also sang along to it as well, and that was captured on video. This is not merely trivial, it's symbolic. It's an expression of who he is. And President Trump has tended to get a lot of praise for that, for being who he is from his base, for being different, for speaking his mind, for not being a typical politician. So the past may not be as helpful an indicator or as helpful a constraint as we may like it. So questions remain as to whether what the public is actually thinking and saying about this administration will help to influence the president's agenda and conduct moving forward. Nonetheless, I want to address three things. First, where public discourse and public opinion about the Trump administration and presidency are now, and the extent to which public opinion matters. Second, what we can learn about the new administration from what we've seen so far, in particular the inauguration speech. And finally, how this weekend's demonstrations, the inaugural protests, and also the Women's March fit into this all. So to the first point, how we should read and contextualize public opinion about the Trump administration during this transition period, where are we and what does that seem to be telling us? Well, historically, precedent dictates that this period of time, as Steve said, is usually a honeymoon period for new presidential administrations. And this is both in terms of media coverage and in terms of public approval. People tend to like the idea of making a fresh start and typically want to feel good about the choice the country has made, even if they weren't supporters. They tend to wait and see what the president's agenda will look like before judging it too harshly. So presidential approval ratings usually start at quite high, and media coverage does tend to sort of give a bit more leeway at the start. For example, at the start of his administration, Barack Obama's approval rating was actually above 70%. And over the course of the first 6 months of his administration, it was typically stayed over 60%. And that wasn't unusual. As far as Gallup's been taking this particular metric, the historical average for presidential job approval rating in this initial period is about 55%, even though the honeymoon period tends to vary. In contrast, I think we all recognize that President Trump has so far not experienced much of a honeymoon period. His approval ratings are actually historically low. According to Gallup right now, it's actually not as bad as it's been. It's at 45% approval, 45% disapproval, so around even in terms of the overall balance. But another poll released by CBS, there's a range, and the poll released by CBS last week indicated that it was as low as 32%. And the relationship with the press is also clearly not experiencing a honeymoon period. Over the weekend, Sean Spicer, the press secretary, held his first press event, and it was quite adversarial. And I think we've heard about that. There's quite a dispute that is still waging, I guess, over the size of the inaugural crowds and whether or not the media is being fair in how they describe that. In the wake of all that, yesterday Sean Spicer even remarked that the relationship with the press had been demoralizing for the administration. He said it's not always negative, describing his administration, and we're not always wrong, kind of making a plaintiff plea. So I think people have sort of seen this relationship as being really problematic. But if the media is to fulfill its role of being a watchdog, of being a check on the administration, of being really the fourth estate, then an adversarial relationship is not something that we should be, appalled by. It's not something that we should be fearing as much. In fact, some people in the media are actually sort of cheering the return of the adversarial media, the return of the media to a more oppositional stance. So the overall question is, does it matter though, right? So President Trump didn't enjoy much of a positive relationship with the press during his campaign, and he was elected nonetheless, right? So does it matter? Well, to some extent, in the past, media and politics scholars have argued that the media aren't just a reflection of the political environment, but rather they are the political environment, right? That coverage shapes public perceptions that form the reality on which political action is based. So public opinion does matter. And media publicity can kill some programs and policy proposals, and it can be crucial in determining whether a presidential appointee will be confirmed by the Senate. So cabinet appointments and confirmations are a clear area in which past administrations have been responsive to public feedback. President Clinton, for example, withdrew 2 of his nominations due to negative attention and pushback. During the confirmation process, it was revealed that both Kimba Wood and Zoe Baird were nominees who were nominees for the Attorney General position, had in the past employed people who were undocumented or not eligible to work in the U.S. or failed to pay taxes on these employees. The Obama administration also had to withdraw more than one of their cabinet appointees due to negative publicity. So there is recent history of cabinet appointments that have failed due to specific issues with taxes and household employees and other sort of minor scandals that have come out during the process. But the confirmation process is already now well underway, and Trump appointees haven't yet completed background checks and filed some of the necessary paperwork. And yet we've sort of moved on from that mini scandal. And so it's possible that this break with tradition and the break with norms may actually be working in their favor. They may have been able to actually avoid the kinds of scandals that have derailed previous appointees simply by sort of like moving on and moving off of that topic. After a minor skirmish in which Elizabeth Warren raised this as an issue and Chuck Schumer sent a letter to Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, things moved ahead, and so did the media. So the influence of public opinion may be limited by that, and it also may be limited by the reality that at the end of the day, the GOP has control of both houses of Congress and is unlikely to want to go against the new Republican president this early on. So there is kind of a sense of inevitability. I'm running out of time a little bit, but I do want to talk just briefly about the inauguration speech itself, because I thought that was rather interesting as well in terms of what we can learn from where this administration is going. In addition to being a hallmark of American democracy that marks the transition of power, it's also important as political spectacle and as an important piece of symbolic politics. And as we know, politics is really largely based on emotional reactions to political symbols, reactions to images and reactions to slogans and reactions to people who become attitude objects around which public opinion and about policy sort of coalesces. So these things matter. The inauguration matters, and the inauguration has typically been an opportunity for newly installed presidents to present their image in a new way, to set a unifying tone, and to a limited extent lay out some sort of a policy vision, at least in very broad strokes. And so most presidents have chosen to mark the occasion to affirm a sense of unity. And a few inaugural speeches have even made history. The most memorable, I think, that you're all familiar with was John F. Kennedy's address in 1961, in which he has this line that I think we all know. The most famous line is, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." But he also said right after that, "My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man." And that's a pretty global communitarian sentiment in which the individual has responsibility to the broader public, but also in which the USA and the United States of America is part of a broader international community, right? That's an expression of important principles. President Reagan's 1981 inaugural was also similarly optimistic and expansive and lay out a clear vision tying individual freedom to small government. In contrast, I would say President Trump's inaugural speech did touch upon some of the themes of restoring power to the people and putting America first, although we all know that there is a very sort of fraught history of that particular phrase coming out of World War II. But he also, perhaps the most memorable phrase from President Trump's speech is that of American carnage. It's very catchy, and I do think it will be remembered, but it's one that to me sounded more like the title of an apocalyptic blockbuster than the way an American president would normally describe the country he was just elected to lead. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. You're going to leave us with carnage.
Yes, I'm leaving on such a positive note.
John, thank you very much.
Thank you. In my previous life as a reporter, editor for the Wall Street Journal, I actually covered President Obama's first inauguration back in 2009. And I was in Washington, and I covered that inauguration. And I have to say the crowd tonight is actually much larger than that inauguration. I think there are well over 1 million people here tonight. So thank you all for showing up. I want to talk a little bit about what I think for anybody, including as a member of the media, has really been since November kind of the media's nervous breakdown following the election results and all the events leading up to the inauguration, something which I think has continued for anybody who's following Twitter or reading the New York Times or the Washington Post and following the networks and what's going on social media. I really think that the press in general is really having a very difficult time trying to figure out kind of what to make of Trump and kind of what's going on. And I think a lot of this is justified. I mean, certainly the press has come under attack before. Anybody who studied history or lived through the past 30, 40, or 50 years, knows that the media has come under attack before, most notably under Richard Nixon. Nixon and Agnew went after the press quite violently, not just in terms of campaign speeches, but the attack on the Pentagon Papers when the government tried to issue and did issue prior restraint and tried to stop the publication of the Pentagon Papers. There have been a number of attacks on the press by every administration over the past 40 or 50 years. But this time I think it's not just that the press seems hysterical and kind of worried about this, but I think there are a number of factors that are kind of feeding this concern that a number of media organizations feel. One of them is that the economics, the underpinnings of the media are quite different and quite perilous. It's been well documented that in general the economics are very scary for most media organizations these days. We see it everywhere we live. Newspapers are closing, the number of reporters is declining, newspaper readership is falling. Those numbers have not changed, and the economics continue to go down. Trump's hostility towards the press is well documented and seems to be increasing. And obviously, as Professor Bell has talked about, the first few days and the sort of Sean Spicer coming out and attacking the press and Trump's obsession with this suggests that this is something that he both understands is something he can use to both mobilize people, but that he can use as a rallying cry is something that I think concerns a lot of folks in the media. And one reason he does this is that he recognizes that the public, by and large, agrees with him. I mean, if you look at all these polls that have been done, the press is not very well admired. Spotlight won Best Picture, and that made everybody feel really good for a while, especially since two of our Northeastern alumni were stars of Spotlight. But the reality is that journalists on all those surveys they do kind of rank just above child molesters in terms of how people feel about how popular they are. And so when Trump attacks the media, that's something that a lot of people kind of back him on. Another thing that hasn't gotten as much attention is that when Nixon went after the press, we didn't fully appreciate it at the time, but the people who kind of own the press, the Sulzberger family at the New York Times, the Grahams at the Washington Post, the Taylor family up here at the Boston Globe, the Bancrofts at the Wall Street Journal, these were family owners, Paley family at CBS, who had owned these institutions for a long time and basically took on the Nixon administration. And those of you who have seen All the President's Men or read books about this time, I mean, this was kind of a nervy thing to take on the President of the United States and publish the Pentagon Papers. And in the end, the Supreme Court voted to reject prior restraint. But it was a nervy thing to kind of get into that fight. Well, right now, except for the Sulzbergers, who are under enormous financial pressure right now in owning the New York Times, right now the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon. He's done a lot of good things to the Washington Post, but again, untested. The Boston Globe is owned by John Henry. Major financial interest is owning the Boston Red Sox, untested. The Wall Street Journal is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who owns, Fox News, untested. The major networks are owned by big public corporations. We live in a very different economic environment, and no one really knows if Donald Trump decides to start locking up reporters on national security grounds, decides to start bringing financial pressure against Amazon as a way of pressuring Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post, goes after the New York Times because it decides to publish things he doesn't like, how they will respond. The government has enormous leverage, financial and otherwise, in terms of national security, if it wants to start pressuring news organizations. And we really don't know how those organizations will respond. And certainly in a legal environment, as Professor Burnham can certainly tell us, the courts have enormous leeway in terms of libel law and other ways to bring pressure to bear on news organizations. As we know, not only does President Trump will be appointing probably next week someone to the Supreme Court, and probably others as people begin to die or retire from the Supreme Court, but there will be a lot of openings on lower courts where a lot of libel laws and other decisions affecting press freedoms will be decided. So I think one of the reasons why the media and the press is so nervous is that they see a landscape, economic, technological, and legal, which makes them very nervous. So I think the media organizations are responding to this. Many of them are responding in a very confrontational way. And one way you can see this is by looking at the words that some of our best media organizations are using. New York Times is using the word lie kind of all the time now. It's not necessarily a word I would use a lot. I think there are other ways to describe what Trump is doing. But I think the New York Times has decided to be very confrontational with Trump. I think the Washington Post is being a little more cautious. I think the Wall Street Journal is trying to decide what to do. I think NPR is struggling with this. I think all the major news organizations are trying to figure out just what to do. in many ways the same way the Democratic Party, I think, is struggling what to do. And, you know, there is this famous line, which is, you know, they always say that presidential candidates or politicians should never pick a fight with an organization that buys ink by the barrelful, right? You never want to piss off the media because the media can kind of go after you by writing articles and sort of attacking you. I think the media now is kind of in this position is, do you want to go after a president now who not only has access to this huge platform, but, you know, people have always underestimated Donald Trump. And, you know, I think the election kind of reminded people Donald Trump is an incredibly savvy media person. He lived his entire life in New York. He dealt with the tabloids. He was covered by the New York Post, which is one of the most savage tabloids out there. He went through 2 divorces and several bankruptcies. He was a reality TV star. He had the #1 television show. You know, he bested 13 Republican candidates, toppled the Republican dynasty, and pulled up one of the most amazing political upsets in history. This is not someone you necessarily want to take on and think you can win. And I think, you know, as Professor Bell pointed out, even a lot of these kerfuffles that have taken place in the past few days, where if you read Twitter obsessively the way I do, where you would have thought, he can't survive this, he can't survive that. I mean, any of us who kind of watch the campaign every 30 seconds like I did, and like probably many of us on this panel thought, and maybe many of us in this room thought, Trump can't survive this, Trump can't survive that. Well, he survived it all, and he's the President of the United States. And I think one of the great lessons of this election, and probably one of the things that Hillary Clinton thinks about, and certainly Joe Biden and others I think are realizing now, is that, you know, he ended up being a lot smarter about how to use the media and how these issues kind of played out in the media than a lot of the media did, and how the Democrats did as well. So I think one of the things that the media is struggling with, as I think the Democrats are, is how to cover him and how to sort of deal with someone who seems to be and seems to understand in this very new media world. It turns out that he is much more astute, in terms of how to use this new media world. And so my final kind of point is to try to understand, you know, what are the other lessons coming out of the election for the media. And it's something I've been trying to apply personally and also in talking to my students. And I think one of the lessons that I personally have tried to apply, and I'm trying to share with my students, is the lesson of breaking out of your bubble. I think that one of the lessons that everybody in the media woke up with starting about 9:30 on election night was that there was way too much punditry on the part of the media, and way too much reliance on polling, way too much reliance on sitting in front of our screens and clicking on 538.com over and over again, and not enough going out and talking to people. And that the inability or the refusal or the laziness of going out to Ohio and Pennsylvania and sort of that old-fashioned going to bars and talking to people ended up blinding a lot of reporters and editors to what was going on in the election, and ended up really misleading readers to what was going on. And so I think one of the benefits to what's going on now is that you are seeing a lot of the best media organizations, including the Post and the Times and NPR and others, sending reporters out. You know, we talk about embedding reporters and sending them out to, you know, Syria and Turkey and kind of overseas, but you're seeing, you know, media organizations now sending people out to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and places like that to try to find out, you know, what's going on, especially among the white working class, but I think more broadly, you know, into neighborhoods and into communities that haven't been covered, and trying to understand what are people thinking about and breaking out of the bubble. You know, we talk a lot about the Northeastern bubble, and I think that's something that the media needs to break out of as well. And I spent the weekend, and I've spent the week since the election, very much trying to add to my Twitter account, adding people of different political views to try to broaden kind of my spectrum. And this weekend in my class on covering the campaign, I sent students out not just to cover the Women's March, but also to interview Trump voters, to go out and widen their Twitter accounts and their social media accounts so that they can stay in touch with people who don't think like that. And I think one of the benefits of being at a university for all of you is that it is a unique opportunity to talk to people who don't think like you. And when we talk a lot about diversity here, and I think it's important that we talk about people from different religious backgrounds and gender backgrounds and race backgrounds, and that's important, I think we need to add political backgrounds to that. And I think we have to make a real effort, wherever we are on the political spectrum, to make sure that we're reaching out to people who don't think like us, because it will become harder as we move through the world to find people who are not part of the big sort. And that we use chances to talk to our roommates or people on our floor or people in our classes and find people, I always tell this story, the day after the election, in my class, someone stood up and she said, "I feel like I can finally come out as a Republican." And I thought it was really striking that she used that language. And it said to me that at a place like Northeastern, where we pride ourselves in trying to be an open campus, here was someone who felt that she couldn't even talk in a class about being a Republican. And I think if this election tells us anything, it's that we need to be a place where people can kind of talk across all these various differences, so we're maybe not a surprise going forward, or at least we can have those conversations and begin to figure out, even if we don't agree, at least we're not a surprise next time about what some of these differences are, and maybe at least understand where people are coming from.
And I think that's a good point. I know we're all chomping at the bit to respond to each other, but I think it's time for us to take some questions from the floor so that we have plenty of time. And I would ask the panelists, if you do have thoughts relative to each other's comments, hopefully they'll come out in the context of the questions. So what I'd like to ask you to do, if you have questions, can we have people come down the aisle here? We're going to take 3 questions at a time to give the panelists an opportunity to look for big themes and make their big points and find the connections between the questions that you're all interested in. And hopefully that'll give us a time to get a good sense of what's out there in the room so that we can take advantage of all of the panelists' perspective on the big questions. So if you could come down, if you have a question, I think it would help us if you could come down to the center so that we can take 3 questions at a time. Please feel free. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions and things people would like to discuss.
Hi, my question is sort of media related. I'm wondering what you, as a panel and as experts in this field, think the media's response to the recent executive gag orders on EP and other agencies. Hi, my question is more about social change and progress. Director Jordan Fisher talked a lot about protesting and social change, but kind of before this election, there was a lot of disputing on social values and how there's moderate Republicans who don't stand up for the values you hear a lot in the media, and yet they have to align based on politics towards those values. I have a lot of Republican friends at school who say, hey, socially we agree, it's just like fiscally we don't agree. And as Professor Coffin said, if they can't talk, if they're labeled as people who don't believe in abortion rights or Planned Parenthood and things like that. So going forward and during protests and things like that, how do you think social change can move towards less polarization and more the idea of, I don't know if it's money, I don't know what the case is, but more towards the idea of we get along on a lot of issues, but we're not willing to reach across the aisle. So.
Okay. Third question. Hi. My question is really in light of the Arizona legislation that was introduced about limiting school and college spaces related to the terms social justice, anything based on ethnicity, race, gathering, all these kind of different identifiers. That very interestingly at the bottom so that we will now begin to continue to judge based on the content of their character for their students, sanitizing the words of Dr. King. But then how kind of the federal government has emboldened a lot of these Republican lawmakers in seeing these kinds of terms that often back social movements today as seemingly threats. to real progress in their society or the way that they see it moving forward. So my question related to this is, how do we respond to this type of government intervention in a way in collegiate spaces and in freedom for what professors will be teaching or students will try to gather and rally around in the future underneath the Trump presidency?
Okay, so questions around the fact that perhaps we have more shared values in the social space, but that the parties are more separate on economic issues, and is there a way to either depoliticize or find more common ground around social issues? Also, what is the response, or what is a possible response to government interventions in the college space around identities and language that we use? And the first one was a question on media.
I can do that first.
Okay, please, John.
So on the gag order thing, I think, so one of the things that I think is happening is, one of the criticisms of media organizations was that what's wrong with Washington reporting is that it's all about access. In other words, basically, Washington reporters just want to get access. They become part of the Washington complex. They want to get invited to parties, and it's all sort of inside the Beltway. And I think one of the good things about what's going on now is that reporters are basically going to be covering things from the outside in. This kind of oppositional reporting, I think, is a good thing. So I think that what you're really seeing, and I think you're seeing this now, basically every reporter is saying, whistleblowers call me up. And so I think that what's happening now is that there's a real effort on the part of journalists to basically say to people at the EPA and everywhere, if you don't like what Trump's doing, give me a call. And there are all these secure drop boxes and things like that that are being set up out there saying, if you don't like what's going on, let me know. And I think that's a really healthy development. So I think that one of the things you'll see, and frankly, I think in a way, Trump's war against the CIA is going to be a boon to journalists. One of the things, if you look back at Watergate, one of the things that really hurt Nixon was that a lot of the leaks about Watergate came from the FBI and the CIA. And I would suspect that one of the mistakes Trump is making is that when you piss off the CIA and the FBI, that's like not a good thing. And so I would suspect that one of the things you're going to see is that a lot of these agencies, Edward Snowden, a lot of the leaks that we've seen, Chelsea Manning, people have access to a lot of secrets in government. And reporters, that's our job, is to get people to tell you things that they shouldn't. And so, I don't know, I think Professor Flynn may have more sense of this. I'm not sure if you ever leaked. You probably don't want to tell us.
Exactly.
But you know what Washington is like. Maybe you want to speak to that. But what is that press-government relationship like? Do people talk to reporters? And at a certain point, when do you try to use the press to get your story out there if you're ticked off?
Well, I think it'll be rich pickings, as you hear. And also keep in mind that, we have a large civil service, so they're there as career players. And we have rules of law still. And so if you really reach a point where, you're getting a lot of dissonance between what you think your duty is and what somebody's asking you to do, an outlet is to share that with the administration. A check in to some extent, I think, on the president is there are not a lot of people that he sort of is loyal to him and came with him and been a part of him that he's now dispersed across the government. He actually ran a very small enterprise, running Trump Enterprise. It was a family, basically, business. And he's showing up in Washington to fill all these positions. And it's not at all clear to me that he can find folks who are in alignment, even if I can figure out what alignment is, right, with whatever he wants. And so giving that, that the opportunities for folks to think it's their duty to share a concern, that's likely to be the environment that he's going to have to operate in. That's going to be really difficult to discipline that process.
I'd like to add something also, though, which is just to think about it in a slightly different way. I think it's really important for us to be concerned about, if there are gag orders on people speaking to the press. But it's also true that the press has a reliance on official sources that is actually a problem that we recognize in political communication. So, the number one type of source that journalists tend to go to for all stories, the number one type of source is government officials, public officials. And in a way, this has historically limited the range of perspectives that are privileged in our public discourse. So I would just also encourage journalists to think about widening their horizons. You talked about going, out and listening to people who are from a different perspective. I think you should also just think about the sources, and think more globally about the types of sources and types of people that you're bringing into this public discussion.
Professor Burnham, can I ask you to address that question about whether there's the potential for this to be a moment in time when there's some kind of realignment of activism on social issues and maybe a rethinking of how we define the parties and what people mobilize around, and if there's going to be some blurring here in terms of how people respond?
I don't really think we know what our party system is going to look like at this moment. I think that a lot is in flux, and whether the Republican Party will survive, what the Democratic Party will look like in 4 years, I think is really all up for grabs. I'm not a political scientist. I'm sure maybe Professor Flynn can tell us more. But on the personal question of how do you choose your party affiliation, and what does it say about you as a political and civically engaged person? None of these parties are perfect. By their very nature, these are mass parties. These are large parties that include elements and policies that you're going to disagree with, and some that you're going to agree with. And we only have 2 of them in our country. And so I think, to say that, to claim that one is a lifelong Democrat or a lifelong Republican is really not to fully engage with or the flux that is the norm in our party partisan politics. And so I think you really have to carefully, one has to carefully examine, obviously you want to be a player, and to be a player, to be civically engaged and an influential player in politics means you do have to make some choices at some point, and stick with those choices and move to improve whatever the views of your chosen party are. That's true, but it's also true that I think we need to begin to look at all of these parties with a somewhat, if not jaundiced, I wouldn't say jaundiced as much as critical eye on both social policies and fiscal policies. It's been said, and I think it's bears repeating, it's impossible to tell exactly what ideology our president is actually aligning himself with. We pretty much know where he is on many of the social issues, not all of them. At least we do know that he's used some of the issues that we care about, some of the equality issues that we care about, to marshal votes and support in a very negative fashion. But we don't really know where he stands with respect to some of these economic issues. And many conservatives, of course, claim that he doesn't really embrace traditional Republican conservatism. So it's really hard to say how this is all going to wash out in Washington, and whether people will lockstep behind him in the Congress in order to get things done, or whether they will see that their own agendas are not really being advanced by this particular president. So I think we're in a very kind of loosey-goosey, jello-y kind of a moment.
I might just add that I think a silver lining of sorts here is, in fact, as I look at some of the really messy challenges we have to deal with, let's say climate change as one, we're not going to deal with that at the national level. It's going to have to be worked at the metro regional level, because that's where it's playing itself out. And it's really complicated and hard. So it's very difficult to figure out how the federal bureaucracy wraps its arm around that very complicated problem. I think there are a lot of social issues fit very much in the lane. We got to work these things out at the city level, at the local level, at the state level, and at the regional level. That's where we're actually going to make some headway. Now, it's helpful if the federal government isn't going in the exact opposite direction of where we need to go, but it's not sufficient to say, federal government fix this stuff for us. It's really hard, and it requires us to work it. And a big appeal for me coming here to Northeastern 5 years ago was this was a part of the country where people were rolling into the season working these issues. And so I don't think we should feel like we've been disenfranchised. I think we should realize here that, hey, this isn't going to be solved by who's ever in the White House. It's going to be solved by our taking these things on. And it's the local level that matters. And thinking about local government and thinking about how you can play a role in that, I think, is very key. And we'll get through this if we take that on.
And Professor Burnham, I think this one might also be in your court regarding how it looks like Republican legislatures at the state level may feel emboldened to start acting on things that would have been inconceivable not so long ago, such as, for example, wanting to outlaw wearing masks at protests, which will affect a number of protesters in South Dakota. Also, identifying particular language or words that people might use as part of their expression of protest as somehow unallowable or unpermissible. Any thoughts on that?
Just that, the really big question is whether the rule of law is going to hold on these issues. It's hard to tell. As Professor Kaufman indicated, we're going to have a new Supreme Court, and perhaps more importantly, we're going to have a large number of new judges at the appellate level. That's really going to transform the federal judiciary, and so some of these issues are clearly of constitutional moment, and I'm not quite sure where they're going to go. And I guess it's also worth saying that Trump is really. President Trump is really the top of a triangle that has kind of been building for a long time. If you look at what happened in Wisconsin and the consequences for public education in that state, in Texas, and in Kentucky, more recently in Kentucky, these are states where this move towards creating cutting against inclusiveness and free expression on college campuses has really surpassed anything that we could imagine. So I think we'll see more. I certainly think we'll see more of that.
I think we can take a couple more questions. Does anybody else want to come to the front?
For those of us who oppose, I was saying that Northeastern is known for practical education, cooperative education, learning by doing. So I'm going to ask each of you just a short question that you can answer. For those of us who oppose the administration, what do you recommend that we do? Short answer, short of setting the fire alarm off in the White House and hoping he leaves. What do you recommend that we can do to, from media, from listening, from people? What advice do you have for us that we can do for those of us who feel we need to do something? Thank you.
I think I made my pitch, which is engaging locally on these issues and really demonstrating there's an alternative narrative that we rage. And I think this is a university that's very deeply entrenched in its community and the communities, and we just need to step up our game there. It's a very important way in which we can do that. And I think a message earlier about, I think that's one of the more remarkable things I saw, this weekend with the marches and so forth, is that people were having to deal with each other. And there were Trump supporters face-to-face with people obviously who stood against them. And when they were actually face-to-face, people have to find their civility. It really is a very human instinct. But when we're in our isolated social media worlds talking back to each other and not having that face-to-face engagement, it's really, we've all probably seen this as families. When we get online with emails, it all sort of unravels in a way that you just really can't get away with. You're at the dinner table across from each other. And so there's that need to really engage, I think, in the face-to-face, that real dialogue that we somehow have to recapture. And we do it in our own community here, hopefully here at Northeastern, and we engage those who are outside our gates. And that's something we can all do. It's some little piece of it.
So I want to pick up on Professor Flynn's comment, because I completely agree. that the ball game is at the local level now. It's at the state and local level, whether we're talking politics or whether we're talking community organizing. In 4 years was going to be, well, in 2 years actually, there's going to be another election. And these guys are going to go back to, most of them, are going to go back to their districts, and they're going to look around and they're going to say, who's on the Trump bandwagon and who's resisting. And that's what's going to drive what happens in 2019, or 18, I guess. And that's what's going to drive what happens in 4 years, what happens at the ground level. And so I think there's a lot of good that came out of this election. The result was deplorable, and I'm speaking, like a neutral professor here who has no point of view, right? But to my view, the result was a tragedy. However, people came out. I thought the Sanders campaign garnered enormous energy for a transformation of our economy, for new approaches to globalism, and that those issues were raised in such a way that they're not going to disappear. There's, the fight for 15. There's the, food justice. These are all issues that are ultimately going to be lifted up, and the immigration issues. All of these issues are, both they're national, but they are at root, these are local issues, and what we do in our local community. Nobody has ever said the word community is bad. States, not so great. Cities, there's problems with cities, but community, everyone, Republicans, Democrats, everyone agrees that what happens in that community is what really matters. And so I think for all of us, and this goes to Professor Kaufman's point of, talking to our neighbors, talking to the, your neighbor who helps you shovel snow, but is also a Trump supporter. But also, is about food justice in your community, or is concerned about, the cost of living in your community. All of these issues, I think, are places that will make a difference, and they will percolate up and determine what happens in the next election, in the next congression. These guys have to run every 2 years. And so they're going to be doing like that. They're going to be figuring out, okay, which way is the country going? And we have control over that. We have control over which way the country goes.
Call to action.
Absolutely. So I would absolutely agree with everything that was just said. Personally, I've been involved with local and state politics quite a bit, and I'm always trying to get people to focus on local state politics, so it's nice to hear people supporting that. But more specifically, in terms of the energy that some people are talking about that came out of and in opposition to their election results, I think that if people really do harness that, a lot of people are very skeptical about the Women's March and what the concrete actions and agenda are that might come out of it. And I would say that it's right to be skeptical, but at the same time, we do have examples of protest movements that have made significant differences. And the most recent example, coming from the other side of the aisle, is the Tea Party, right? The Tea Party protest. And we have very concrete research, a recent Harvard study that shows the Tea Party substantially affected not just electoral outcomes, but also how existing legislatures voted, right? So the Tea Party moved the GOP overall significantly to the right? They changed the conversation, they moved people to the right, and they changed how people who are currently elected were voting. And they did that because they were organized and they were threatening. They basically said that if you don't, if you're not voting correctly, we will primary you, right? We will find someone to run against you. And it's not always, I study public opinion, and public opinion is really important, I think, but it's not always about changing hearts. A lot of it is about changing incentives. So if these legislators are incentivized to go against some of the things that we don't, want to see happen in terms of the Trump agenda, then they will react accordingly, right? So I think that people should be energized and sustained in their activity. So, coming out and demonstrating, that is just one part of it. Making those phone calls and being involved in an ongoing basis with with your, local organizers that have many other forms of local organizing and putting your voice forward. That's really important as well.
Do you subscribe to the Boston Globe?
Yes, I think you told us that in the open classroom, so that was my number one thing. The New York Times.
And the New York Times?
Yes.
NPR? Do you give money to NPR? BUR? Washington Post? Cheap, $3.99 a month. Okay, really. I mean,
You get a free subscription with an EDU.
Yes.
yeah.
I was just going
But
to say.
I mean,
Actually
I mean,
free.
I mean, the point. Information is not free, and these institutions are really at the front lines of fighting for these things. And NPR always says this, for the price of a latte. But I mean, the point is, these are institutions that are really fighting for this stuff, and everybody who's on Yahoo News and all this stuff and on Twitter. I mean, for a few $100s a year, you're not only informing yourself, but you're really supporting these institutions, which frankly, much more than Starbucks and and stuff like that are really supporting this fight. And so I really, when Spotlight came out and everybody was doing this, Sasha Pfeiffer, who's one of the heroes of Spotlight, used to end everything by saying, subscribe to the Boston Globe, because that's really what makes this possible. And so I really cannot emphasize that enough. I mean, it just drives me crazy. I mean, it drives, there's the whole point of the Women's March where everybody kept on saying, where were all of you 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago when the election took place, and where will you be in 2 years? And again, I mean, Jeff Bezos has made the Washington Post accessible to everybody, and the Washington Post is doing incredible work. The New York Times, I mean, these are really going to be at the front line for the issues you care about, but whoever you vote for. And especially in trying to build these coalitions and to build these conversations, if people want to have the same set of facts, these are the institutions that are going to build them. So, it really, for a few $100s a year, everyone can have the same set of facts. And I would just urge you, I mean, I applaud you for the Times and the Globe, but, add the Post, add NPR, throw in the Atlantic and, a couple of others. We can actually start having real conversations in this country again.
I'd like to respond to the question about what each of us can do in a slightly different way. And I would say that it's up to each of us to challenge our imaginations, because I think we have both a crisis and opportunity of imagination. We could not imagine that someone who said and did the things that Donald Trump did could win. We could not imagine that we would have a president who was comfortable lying. We did not imagine we would have a president who would issue gag orders to federal employees within a few days of taking office. We need to be able to expand our imaginations, to not be trapped by our understanding of precedent and our own iconography of American democracy. We can learn from them, certainly, as we have tonight, but I think we need to stretch our imaginations beyond them, because this is unprecedented. But as Professor Burnham has alluded, there is an opportunity for imagination because we don't know yet what will be, and so much can come out of this. And so challenge your imaginations in both directions. And with that, I am going to hand things back over to Dean Poyger.
Yes, thank you very much to our five panelists for an enlightening conversation, and I certainly would second that we need to widen our imagination. I also would encourage you again to think about broadening your networks, to expose yourselves to opinions that are not your own, to not be afraid to engage with difficult questions, and to do that on campus as well as off campus. We all have heard how important local action is always, but how important it is in this moment, local and state action. And of course, we also always have ambitions of making a difference in the broader world. So again, broaden your networks, widen your imaginations. You can do a little bit of that by just hanging out a little bit more with our panelists and talking to someone whom you don't know yet at our reception. Also think about the subsequent events that Dean Jose described to you already, where in smaller smaller groups you can talk about these issues. Of course, also challenge your professors, challenge your fellow students to engage in questions to which you don't have the answers already, in asking questions that might have some unpredictable outcomes ultimately. Again, thank you so much for a stimulating panel and for good questions from you, the audience.